So my talk today is going to focus on these four big picture questions. I'm going to begin by reviewing the historical context of Nefertiti's reign. So for my colleagues who are in the audience, feel free to take out your knitting. I won't get offended if you don't pay attention. And we'll also then turn to an examination of Egyptian queenship in general and Nefertiti specifically. This will in turn set up my discussion about the discoveries I've made regarding her Sunshade of Re temple, a structure that was mentioned on the foundation texts of the ancient city where it was found, but it had not actually been discovered. I will then turn to an interpretation of some of the evidence which sheds light on the funerary aspects of the Sunshade of Re, specifically my discovery of another lost structure associated with the Sunshade and its role in the afterlives of the non-royal dead at el-Amarna. So, Akhenaten's 17-year reign, which was from approximately 1353 to 1336 BCE, begins in the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom. This is one of the most prosperous time periods in ancient Egyptian history. The vast Egyptian empire in this era stretched down to the Sudan in the south and up to the very northern reaches of Syria. The wealth of this empire was at its height under Amenhotep III, who was the father of Akhenaten. This period of incredible economic stability allowed Amenhotep III to initiate great building plans throughout the country. So this allows us to kind of discuss what are temples, how do temples function within Egypt. They're core institutions, and they're endowed by the king with lands and material goods, and the temples then, in turn, sort of redistribute that to the general population through work. So as well as being economic engines, temple compounds were not simply houses for deities, but were microcosms as well of Egyptian cosmogony, in other words, the universe-creating capacity of the divine. The proper functioning of these temples guaranteed the continuance of prosperity for the entire kingdom. Temple art provides mechanisms for the king and the elite to assert their ideology and their power to the illiterate, also, who on special occasions were allowed to enter these temples. And these people, we must remember, made up approximately maybe 95% of the population. So art was not simply decoration, but it rather can be understood as artifact, because to make art or architecture was to give order to the world. So for this reason, archaeology is often better at sometimes communicating the politics of a pharaoh's reign rather than a pharaoh's official texts, which might be influenced by a variety of political factors. So Amenhotep III instituted several changes during his reign, and these were moderate changes, but they were quite notable for a society that truly thrived on uniformity and tradition. The Egyptians had always venerated the sun god Re, also sometimes called Ra. However, Amenhotep III appears to have paid particular and unusual emphasis to the sun god. In year 30 of his reign, he changed his own long list of names and titles to include the name Aten. In its form, as the visible sun disk in the daytime sky, the god Aten is hailed as the actual image of the god Re. In other words, it's the visible form of Re in the daytime sky. And again, Amenhotep III paid unusually marked attention to this previously very minor and marginal deity. Amenhotep III had several children with his wife Queen T, but the eldest son, Tutmosis, predeceased his father. So the youngest, called Amenhotep for his father, became the heir apparent. A few years after the death of Amenhotep III and his assumption of the throne, Amenhotep IV, whose name meant Amun is satisfied, changed his name to Akhenaten, one who is effective for the Aten. During the very first year of his reign, Akhenaten, who was then still called Amenhotep IV, completed the monuments his father had begun, including parts of the temple to Amun at Karnak. According to inscriptions on these structures, he was married to Nefertiti sometime before his 4th year in office. None of Nefertiti's titles indicate a royal lineage. We can only assume that Nefertiti was the daughter, likely of a noble but not necessarily royal family. By the end of his 4th year, like his father, Akhenaten had also built prolifically at the site of Karnak. However, in a radical departure from tradition, and probably an insult to the god Amun, the massive complex he built was not only larger than Amun's main temple at Karnak, it was also dedicated to another god, the god Aten. On an inscription that he placed within Amun's temple right next door, Akhenaten records a speech to his court where he explains that all gods but the Aten are false, including the god Amun. The footprint of the Aten complex that you see here is actually only one court of the entire structure. We know from inscriptions that he likely had at least 3 additional structures as well as this one, but their archaeological traces have been lost. So in other words, you're probably only seeing a quarter of the entire extent of the Aten complex. In this new complex, the god Aten, who had traditionally been represented as a hawk-headed man with a sun disk crown, had been given a new image as well as a new home. The god's image is abstracted to a hovering sun disk with rays of light streaming from it. Each ray ends in a hand, which uphold Akhenaten and his wife and occasionally offer various gifts to them. Although at first glance this appears to be a rather personal and even attentive god, the hands of the Aten only extend to a very short list of items and people. Neither the children of Akhenaten and Nefertiti nor the common people are blessed with the Aten's attention. However, the Aten's rays very frequently touch his own temples, his own offerings, and scenes of natural beauty. So the changes Akhenaten wrought didn't stop with this new temple and a new image for a reconceived god. He created an entirely new belief system, one that completely negated almost all the traditions of his people, including their time-honored burial practices. The religion has changed. Ancient Egyptian art is entirely nested in Egyptian traditional religious belief systems. If the religion has changed, the art must therefore change. Using the main mode of propaganda available to him, Akhenaten starts to harvest the iconography developed over thousands of years to explain and communicate the changes of his religion. So he borrowed from representations of fertility figures like the Nile god Hapi, who was shown with a pendulous stomach and breast. Akhenaten reappropriates this fertility-associated imagery as a means to communicate the fertility and abundance as conveyed by a belief in the Aten. So we get statues like this. He represented himself and Nefertiti as overweight with bowed backs and spindly limbs. And to further emphasize the exceptional status of himself and his family, Akhenaten exaggerated all of their natural features. This elongation of the face, the slitted eyes and deep cheeks, paired with the slackness of his musculature, likely shocked his audience. And this may have been intentional. Akhenaten didn't mean for his changes to be subtle or palatable. He wanted for his audience to take notice and may have even wanted for them to be shocked or even disturbed. This is a clear indication, a radical representation of the fact that everything has changed. By this time, Amenhotep IV, whose name had meant Amun is satisfied, has changed his name to the more explicit Akhenaten, one who's effective for the Aten, indicating what the king now feels is his true mission, which is to act on behalf of the god Aten. He also begins an eradication program directed at the worship of Amun. The names and images of Amun and many other traditional gods were hacked away in hundreds of temples all over Egypt. On the central figure of the block here, the god Amun has been partially hacked out. Gods associated with the sun god Re, however, such as Re's daughter Hathor, seem to have been safe from this kind of destruction. It's not universal, that's not uniform, but most of the time, if you are related in some way to the solar cult, Akhenaten went a little bit easier on you. Around the 4th or 5th year of Akhenaten's reign, he decided to move north, away from the southern city of Luxor, indicated here by the orange star, to establish a new royal city entirely devoted to the Aten in the virgin desert at el-Amarna. Even today, this is a really arid place. His huge new city was erected incredibly quickly and had several features that were not found in other ancient Egyptian sites. The only temples were those dedicated either to the royal family or to the Aten and were not roofed, but consisted of huge courtyards open to the sun. The tombs at el-Amarna were not permitted to show the traditional afterlife or the rituals of burial. Instead, they showed minimal scenes of the owners themselves and focused instead on scenes of the royal couple worshiping the Aten. In the north here of this map, we have the start of the Royal Road, which is the main road that formed the central artery of the city. It begins with the royal palaces that were sited in this area, each occupied by separate members of the royal family. And the road continues in a straight line down to pass all the main temples and those main administrative areas, and then ends at Kom, my site, which I believe to be the site of the quote-unquote lost Sunshade of Re temple of Nefertiti. The modern site of the city, which Akhenaten called Aten, or the horizon of the Aten, is a real treasure for the archaeologist because once the reigns of Akhenaten and Nefertiti ended, the court almost immediately left the area. Only very small pockets of people remain, and the rest of the city was completely abandoned. There is almost no subsequent occupation layer at all on top of the vast majority of the entire ancient city. So this allows the site to be incredibly well preserved. So the walls of the ancient house that you see here are preserved to, I want to say maybe 1.5 meters, which is, it's Egypt's Pompeii. The famous bust of Nefertiti, shown here, was also found at the site of el-Amarna. And using that as a convenient pivot, I'm now going to explore Nefertiti and her queenship a little bit further. The office of the Egyptian queen was traditionally concerned with assisting and supporting the divine kingship both before and after the Amarna period. The depictions of Amenhotep III's queen, T, in the tomb of Cairo particularly demonstrate this, as there T is explicitly equated with the goddess Ma'at. Ma'at is both a goddess and a concept that governed the way the Egyptian universe functioned. Without Ma'at, considered proper cosmic order and truth, creation itself would cease to exist. Further, at Queen T's temple at Sedinga in southern Egypt, she's equated explicitly with the goddess Hathor as well, a goddess of sexuality and rebirth. So these two examples demonstrate the Egyptian tradition of equating the reigning queen with goddesses associated with the proper functioning, support, and regeneration of the universe itself. Queens, through their divinity, their fertile divinity, are celebrated for their ability to offer rebirth to the king and the cosmos itself, ensuring eternal life. Female goddesses were essential to the rebirth of the cosmos, which the Egyptians believed happened every day at dawn, and the king traditionally represented the male aspects of this regeneration, while the queen represented the female aspects. However, the female creator goddesses had been rendered anathema by Akhenaten. So he created a gaping void in his new religion. Traditional Egyptian religion functioned by creating triads. It would pair a male with a female god who in turn create offspring and thus the universe itself. The only divine figure in the Amarna period is the Aten, who is either male or gender neutral, depending upon how Akhenaten was feeling that day. The traditional triad grouping was recreated within the restrictions of Atenism to include Akhenaten and Nefertiti as the mythic offspring Shu and Tefnu to the very first creator god. The king and queen thus served to fill a void left by their abandoning of the traditional pantheon. It appears not only Nefertiti, but their daughters were perhaps all used to satisfy the need for a female divine presence associated with sexual regeneration. Nefertiti was associated with the solar goddess Hathor as early as their stay in Luxor. Hathor is known, again, as the goddess of sexuality, fertility, and rebirth, and the fact that Nefertiti often wears Hathor's trademark crown in the Aten temple at Karnak clearly associates her with this goddess and her abilities. Known as the Lady of Drunkenness, festivals held in Hathor's honor would have put any University of Chicago kegger to shame. Coachella ain't got nothing on a festival of drunkenness. Poems dedicated to Hathor emphasize sexual metaphor, and Hathor's sexual attributes are celebrated in many myths, including one where she flashes her pubic region in order to shock her father Re out of depression. That was Hathor. We love her dearly. The adoption of this crown by Nefertiti establishes Nefertiti's status as, if you forgive me, a sex goddess in her own right, able to manifest that regenerative power of sexual rejuvenation herself. Although it was damaged in antiquity, the reconstruction shown here of Akhenaten's sarcophagus further demonstrates the role that Nefertiti played in relationship to her husband. The sarcophagus is embraced on all four sides by figures of Nefertiti, who I've highlighted here in the light blue rectangles. Her image replaces the far more traditional Isis, who is the goddess who normally embraces royal sarcophagi. She is meant to grant resurrection to the king. This is a reference to one of the best-known myths of ancient Egypt. After Osiris is dismembered by his jealous brother Seth, Isis, with her wisdom and her magic, puts Osiris back together and gives him the ability to have sexual intercourse with her one last time so that she can conceive an heir, Horus. And this ensures the proper continuance of Ma'at, or proper order and creation itself. So Isis's abilities to revive and to create life is invoked here. She's invoked as the means to achieve rebirth itself. She's the medium through which the king is rejuvenated and reborn in the afterlife. By replacing Isis with the queen on this sarcophagus, Nefertiti is explicitly equated with these sexual abilities and magical capacity, a sexual goddess of cosmogony in her own right. Thus, Nefertiti is explicitly equated with both Isis and Hathor, two goddesses whose sexual capacities grant resurrection and renewal to the king. These abilities are likely the forces being invoked and celebrated in Nefertiti's lost Sun Temple complex, which is to be more properly termed, after its ancient Egyptian title, a Sunshade of Re. And that's the subject that I'm going to now turn to. A Sunshade of Re temple can also be called a sun temple. It's a cultic locale particular to the New Kingdom, traditionally associated and dedicated to the solar god. It encompasses rituals dedicated to the cosmogonic renewal of the world, the universe itself, but particularly as associated with the solar cycle. The term sunshade refers not to actual shade, but rather indicates that the actions carried out in it are under the overarching attention or the spirit of the sun god. Because just like today, they use the word shoot or shade to refer to ghosts as well, just like we do. Due to its solar associations, sunshades of Re were kind of popular at Tel el-Amarna. Most kings only have one in their reign. Akhenaten, we think, may have had 9, if not more. The title Sunshade of Re can be applied to a variety of buildings, from structures that range in size from just a small chapel within the temple of another god, which is the example that you see here, or it can be applied to a large freestanding temple complex. At Amarna, Akhenaten's capital, a sunshade is frequently an entire complex dedicated to the Aten. Well, frequently, we have 2. So the Aten, again, remember, is the visible form of Re. We know through inscriptions that Akhenaten had given all the female members of the royal family their own sunshade, not only at Amarna, but also at other locations throughout Egypt as well. However, only 2 of them have been found. Akhenaten therefore considered royal women to be the proper custodians of Sunshade of Re temples, which hadn't been the case previously, so this is new. Our primary evidence for the traditional objective of a Sunshade of Re temple derives from the mortuary temple of Amenhotep III, Akhenaten's dad, from an inscription detailing a Sunshade of Re chapel within it. On that stele, it's made clear the Sunshade temple was a locale for making offerings to the sun god in its form as a creator god. in, again, that universe or cosmogonal creating sense. So when the sun sets every night, it's in the manifestation of the aging form of the sun god who travels through the dangerous underworld to emerge reborn in the morning as the child sun. Through this rebirth, all of existence is also reborn again every day. This is what the solar chapel focuses upon. The safeguarding this rebirth was essential to the well-being of the entire land. So the safeguarding of the sun god, simplified in Akhenaten's reign to the sun disk Aten, would have been a pretty high priority for Akhenaten. However, this is Akhenaten, so he, of course, had to place his own interpretation onto these shrines. The Sunshade's association with rebirth and renewal dovetailed neatly into his use of Nefertiti and his daughters as the representatives of the female divine generative presence needed by his cult, so he combined the two. The Sunshade Temple of Nefertiti invoked her capacity as a creator goddess to safeguard or perhaps even bring about the rebirth of the sun every day. This is a reconstruction of Princess Meritaten's Sunshade of Re temple complex. Before my discovery at el-Amarna, it was the only excavated Sunshade of Re temple at el-Amarna. Note that Meritaten inherited this structure actually from Akhenaten's minor wife, Kia, who disappears from the historical record sometime around year 16. In this reconstruction, you can see the size of those man-made lakes, those pools of water, and the extensive garden that was part of this sun temple complex. We also have evidence for several garden areas and pools at Nefertiti's sun temple at el-Amarna as well. Both sites are situated on a desert plain. The maintenance of the standing water in these man-made lakes and pools and the maintenance of these gardens represents an enormous outlay of work and capital. The labor to maintain the site would have been incredibly prodigious, especially underneath the hot Egyptian sun. The appearance of these structures as fertile areas must therefore have been of paramount importance. According to Egyptian myth, when the world was very first created, it was a watery, chaotic space, and out of that water sprang vegetation and forms of life. So this, then, is a baby picture, a physical manifestation or portrait of that very first moment of creation. These items together all suggest that the sun temples of both Nefertiti and her daughter were dedicated again to these aspects of the queen that are associated with these regenerative aspects of queenship. So this isn't without precedent in Egyptian religion. I have to emphasize this. Royal women could act as priestesses to Amun, for example, in an office called the God's Wife of Amun. This is by far one of the most powerful religious positions in all of Egypt. It becomes particularly powerful in the later periods. She's not only called the God's Wife of Amun, another title for the station was, please forgive me, this is about to get a little bit blue, the God's Hand. This second title is a more explicit reference to the duties of the God's Wife of Amun, as it refers to the myth that the first creator god, forgive me, self-pleasured in order to create the seed of existence that became the universe itself. The duty of the God's Wife of Amun was to inspire the god towards this act, to ensure that the universe itself would continue to be made. People in antiquity didn't blush about these sorts of subjects as we do today. So up until now, I've discussed the role of Nefertiti in Akhenaten's new belief system and the identity of Sunshade of Re temples in general as a means to explain the original function of those structures which were so significant to the Amarna period. I'm going to now review my contention that the site called el-Amarna can be identified as the Sunshade Temple of Nefertiti. I want to emphasize, by the way, that el-Amarna is the Arabic title for the site, and Sunshade of Re is the ancient Egyptian title. So we'll begin by discussing these items in association, again, with that structure that we just reviewed, the sunshade that the Egyptians called the Rowed-an-Aten, which we just saw a reconstruction of before. It was originally dedicated, again, to Akhenaten's secondary wife, Kia, and so it was designed to have queenly associations from the beginning. So this is a view, believe it or not, of Kom el-Amarna from Google Earth. Yes, it's an ugly baby, but it's mine. These green lines outline the outer walls of the complex. It was approximately the size of 5 football fields, 5 American football fields. The site was partially excavated in the 1980s and 1990s by Barry Kemp, but due to budget constraints, the material from the excavation hadn't been subjected to a post-excavation analysis, and that's where I came in. I'm going to now continue by orienting you to the site itself, and then I will review the inscriptional, art historical, and archaeological evidence that demonstrate the site is the Sunshade Temple of Nefertiti. I have here a very schematic map that Barry and I put together. Excavations revealed a mud brick buttressed wall with 4 entrance gateways. 2 pylons or entrance gateways were in the western wall, 1 in the eastern wall, and the 4th in the southern wall. There was also an internal wall found right down the center that bisected the entire enclosure, running east-west between the 2 gates in the western wall, creating 2 totally separate areas within the enclosure wall, thus making it look very similar to the princess's sunshade array that we saw before. The buildings within the southern half are much better preserved than those in the north. They're set back primarily off the north-south axis. You see that there's an area marked depression. It's not that it's sad, it doesn't need Zoloft. It's very intentionally cut in and then very leveled off. Once you're there, you can see that the ground is abnormally level. It appears that it was an area that was set aside for large crowds. There are no structures in that area, and again, it is unnaturally smooth, so it was very intentionally smoothed over. The buildings, the southeast section of houses, these were likely priest houses. The elevated central structure we have creatively called the central platform. It was likely a window of appearance for those of you who care about these things. The south pavilion was in all likelihood also another public area that we are not entirely sure what the function is yet. And then the south shrine. The south shrine is the only stone area within this enclosure. Now, the northern enclosure is much less understood. Settlements dating to the Coptic and Roman eras had been established on top of the central Amarna period structure. According to Barry Kemp, the size of the tops of the walls uncovered in 1993 showed that it was originally a very large-scale mud brick building, the Amarna period material, but the full ground plan of this is unknown. Gillian Pike works on some of the Coptic material from this site, and so we're hoping to be able to excavate that at some point. A second stone, yes. We also found an extensive baking and brewing area that was quite extensive. The area was found to be dense with a particular kind of mold, a bread mold, a subject that we're going to return to later because that's an important item of evidence. The North Shrine is, just like the South Shrine, the only entirely stone structure within this half of the compound. So we very creatively called these the North Shrine and the South Shrine. I'm sure that you're very impressed with our originalness. Archaeologists are very boring. Everything else within this compound is built entirely of mud brick. There are only 2 entirely stone structures in this area. So there is no question that these are 2 regions that are the primary focus of this area. In addition, we also found several garden plots. We also found several pools of water as well. So in that way, it's possible that it may have been just as fertile and abundant as the princess's sun temple that we saw before. So let's look at some inscriptions. It's the best part of every lecture. So this block retains part of a royal head and a fragmentary inscription. The long upright of the Shu fan is preserved in the viewer's right column, which is over the sun hieroglyph, and a logographic stroke for preserving the word shoot. This is another fragment. Poor craftsmanship and preservation caused the epigraphy of the block to be enigmatic until examined under really hard raking light, but it also certainly preserves the word Shut Re, or sunshade of Re. So there's no doubt then that Kom el-Amarna is a sunshade of Re temple. There is no question, absolutely not. When we found those first blocks that clearly, when I found these first blocks that preserved the clear evidence this was definitely a sunshade of Re, I was an enthusiastic human being. It was a very exciting moment. But, as is often the case with archaeology, this is a fragmentary inscription. I've got hundreds of examples of Nefertiti's names and titles from this area, but none of them are preserved in clear association with the title Sunshade of Re, which is very inconvenient. So missing that smoking gun, we have to turn to other items of evidence to try to figure out what is going on. Who is the owner of this structure? This is that first block again. You can see, as I said before, the forehead of a royal person wearing the uraeus snake. Marion Eaton-Krauss and I have both independently figured out that at Amarna, Nefertiti wears a single uraeus and no other female member of the royal family, including Akhenaten's mother, Queen T, shares this feature. This is unlike their earliest representations at Karnak, where Nefertiti can be shown with a double uraeus. So this is likely, therefore, to be either Akhenaten or Nefertiti. There's only one exception to this rule, by the way, that I know of, and that's Nefertiti on Akhenaten's sarcophagus. So I have many fragments of Nefertiti's names and titles from Kom el-Amarna, but none from Queen T. In other words, what I'm trying to say is if this had been Queen T's sunshade, I would have had many examples of her name, but I have absolutely none. Again, this is still not a smoking gun, however. It just simply rules out one person. We still don't necessarily know whose this is. But I believe the archaeological evidence provides additional support. Remember that site that I said, the baking and brewing area that had those bread molds? These are those bread molds. In the form of a cone, these produce the distinctive bread loaves that were associated in the New Kingdom with festivals and special events. So this is special bread. This is festival bread. There are only two other areas at Amarna, the Great and Small Aten temples, that had concentrations of these molds as well as large-scale industrial baking areas. Barry Kemp and I both believed that this indicates Kom el-Amarna had the same preeminence in the city as those two structures, and that the area can be associated with the very first building plans of Akhenaten. So why is that important? Its location in the city is an indicator of the status of the site. It's aligned directly on the original pathway of the royal road as it was very first conceived, because after a time, the road deviated in the southern suburb to follow the natural contours of the area in parallel with the riverbank. Kom el-Amarna does not follow that altered later pathway. It is on a complete straight line of the royal road. So it is undeniably part of that very first wave of construction at Amarna. So what does that tell us? Well, we can look at another inscription to explain it. Egyptologists, I figure I'd throw in the transliteration. Feel free to parse my grammar. As one of the earliest buildings on the Amarna plain, Barry Kemp and I both believe that the site is associated with an inscription dealing with the founding of the city on the boundary stela. On these inscriptions, Akhenaten indicates several buildings were to be constructed first at Akhenaten. The first two buildings in the inscription, the House of the Aten and the Mansion of the Aten, have long been identified with the Great and Small Aten temple. However, the third, called the Sunshade of Re and dedicated to Nefertiti, had been considered lost to the archaeological record. So to summarize the points that I'm trying to make, according to the boundary stela, 3 buildings were to be constructed first at Amarna: the House and Mansion of the Aten and the Sunshade of Re Temple of Nefertiti. Only 3 sites at Amarna were provided with industrial food production areas, and only 3 sites have evidence of conical bread molds. Further, 3 of the largest sites at Tel el-Amarna are on the original pathway of the royal road. The first and second of all of these are the House of the Aten and the Mansion of the Aten, and the third is Kom el-Amarna. Kom el-Amarna is therefore very likely to be that third building mentioned in the boundary stela and the Sunshade of Re of Nefertiti. So we were very excited about this. We published it. Everyone really enjoyed that. That's really underestimating, by the way, my excitement at finding that inscription. I may have been running around like a maniac with the fragment over my head, possibly, allegedly. In the summary of the points that I've covered so far, let's just go back. What did we talk about? We've reviewed Amarna queenship and the role Nefertiti played as a goddess in relationship to the Aten cult. We've discussed the Sunshade of Re temples, establishing their role in the Amarna belief system as a means to ensure renewal by invoking the abilities of Nefertiti as a divine progenitor to protect the rebirth of the sun god, celebrated in his form as a creator god. Since all Sunshade temples at Amarna were associated with royal women, their capacity to assure regeneration would also be at play here, whether Nefertiti owned this sunshade or not. We've also reviewed the evidence that supports the identity of Kom el-Amarna as a Sunshade of Re temple, and reviewed the evidence that it indicates it was in all probability owned by Nefertiti, which is, by the way, accepted field-wide at this point. So we can say with complete confidence that Kom el-Amarna is a Sunshade of Re temple, and that it is associated with regeneration and rebirth of the sun god, assisted by the royal woman who owned this structure. So I'm going to now turn to a discussion for Kom el-Amarna's funerary role at Amarna, related to the discovery of a second structure at the site of Kom el-Amarna. This is, again, that first fragment that we looked at. So after I published this, Marc Gabold at the University of Montpellier suggested that the other traces on it revealed an additional structure, one that he had actually been trying to track down for years, a building that is mentioned only once at Amarna itself, called the Rowed-an-Aten in ancient Egyptian. So Dr. Gabold and I are still arguing about how exactly to translate this. This is a question well, anyway, let's not go into that. Anyway, so we're still sort of having a debate, and we both respect each other, so I'm not going to offer a translation other than just simply calling it the Rowed-an-Aten in ancient Egyptian. So here's that original block. So it's easier to see my analysis. I'm going to move them a bit. So as you can see, in the reconstruction of the column on the left, the traces in the left column preserve the word Rowed. So when Mark contacted me about whether or not this was the Rowed-an-Aten, I said, you know, there are other buildings at Amarna that begin with the word Rowed. We got a Rowed menu, we've got a couple of other things. I'm like, I don't know if I believe you, because there's really only one mention of the Rowed-an-Aten. We don't even know that it's a real structure. Yeah, don't say that. You're always going to be wrong. So, because the very next season, what did I find? I found proof that Mark was right. So, I'm going to again separate these. On this block, enough proof remains that the word following the word Rowed is indeed Anku. So after I discovered that block, the next several seasons revealed even more examples, and using this evidence, the full ancient Egyptian title of the site can be reconstructed as you see here and translated in this way, the Sunshade of Re in the Rowed-an-Aten. This in many ways parallels the other Sunshade of Re temple that we have, which is the Sunshade of Re in the Rowed-an-Aten, which translates as a viewing place of the Aten. Before this evidence was discovered, the only other time the word Rowed-an-Aten is mentioned on an actual monument to Tel el-Amarna is from the tomb of Ai, which you see here. He's a high-ranking courtier. Its mention was always a puzzling aspect of this tomb. Some scholars doubted that it actually had even a real-life parallel. So it was quite exciting to realize that not only was it a real place, but that we'd found it at Kom el-Amarna. So it occurs on the ceiling here of the main axis of the tomb, the area painted red here, which is carved with 3 lines of inscription. So this is a close-up of this. So this section of the text says, "May you be given incense and libation in the Rowed-an-Aten by the king, the son of the Aten, who assigns it to you forever. May you receive it, and may you go forth before him every day." Now, there are 3 significant points to draw from this evidence. First, the title refers to a site where provisions are given by the king to his courtier, and second, that those provisions are offered in the context of a mortuary cult, likely as an offering to the deceased to support their continued existence after death. Third, you'll also notice that it doesn't mention a sunshade of Re, which is very inconvenient. Desperately in search of other parallels, I spent way too much time in the British Museum one summer, finding this hieratic ostracon, an inscribed pottery sherd from el-Amarna. It contains one of the only other mentions of the Rowed-an-Aten, and I'll underline it here in red. Based on first analysis, the ostracon appears to reference the Rowed-an-Aten in association with the purchase of material goods, or at least the concepts of material goods. Also, like the Tomb of I, it also makes no reference to the sunshade of Re. So we were all really surprised to find out that not only was the Rowed-an-Aten real, but that it was also directly associated with the sunshade of Re. Because the sunshade of Re doesn't mention it, and it doesn't mention the sunshade of Re. We had no idea that they were within the same compound. Now, there are three possibilities to explain these omissions. So some of my fellow Egyptologists have likely noted that there is a definite article pa before the name. This evidence doesn't indicate this is a domain name, like those related to Karnak, for example. But that's actually a discussion that's probably less suited to a public lecture. So I'm very happy to answer questions about that later. But the other possibilities to explain this disconnect, why they don't talk to each other, is that the sunshade was constructed first and the Rowed-an-Aten was added to it later, or the Egyptians thought of the two areas as separate and saw no need to necessarily reference them together. Since other mentions of these two sites, this indicates one other hieratic ostracon, they all span a really long time that extends past the very first wave of construction at Amarna. So this favors the second interpretation, that the Egyptians thought of the two as separate institutions. It appears the only time the Egyptians felt the need to reference the sunshade and the Rowed-an-Aten together was at the site itself, in order to accurately reflect the makeup of the complex, as they seem to also do for the Maru-Aten, right, the sunshade of Akhenaten, of the daughter of Akhenaten. So the evidence from this ostracon and the inscription from the Tomb of I provide a first glimpse into the character or function of the Rowed-an-Aten. The ostracon suggests it was actively engaged in the consumption of material goods, and due to the evidence of the inscription in the Tomb of I, where it's identified as a place where the deceased will receive offerings from the king, it's likely that some of these material goods were being sent to the temple in this manner, were meant to be supplying some kind of funerary cult. So that's really interesting, because we know almost nothing about the funerary practices of the Amarna period. Akhenaten's, the tombs of the non-royal dead at Amarna contain no evidence for their belief in the afterlife. We have no definitive understanding of how they received offerings or anything else. So this is exciting. So it's possible the sunshade of Re was dedicated to the cult of the sun god in his form as a creator god, and the Rowed-an-Aten was associated with the king's support of the courtiers' mortuary cults. Now, this does seem to be initially a strange combination, but in fact, as I looked at the evidence in the past, both before and after the Amarna period, all the other sunshades of Re in Egyptian history are traditionally associated with the dead. This title parallels also the other sunshade of Re that we looked at before, also, which is quite interesting. So let's go in more of that question of why is it that sunshades of Re are associated with the dead? How can we know that? First off, almost all of the ones before and after the Amarna period are located in mortuary temples, or temples of millions of years, which are associated with the support of the divine king for eternity. But in addition, the sunshade of Re of Hatshepsut is located in her mortuary temple, and it is the earliest sunshade of Re chapel in existence, located in Luxor, Thebes. Now, located in Sheikh el-Gurna, close to her mortuary temple, the tomb of Hatshepsut's overseer of the treasury, named Senemiah, preserves an important inscription that discusses how his spirit will participate in the sunshade of Re after his death. So this is an inscription from the area. It says, "May you eat the offering bread to the side of the stairs in front of Ptah, the Lord of the Aeneid. May you take half of that bread to the place where he is upon the altar of the Sunshade of Re." Now this is that exact chapel that is being referenced in that inscription. We can understand from this text that the Sunshade of Re is a place where this deceased person can go to eat the offering bread left there at the side of the stairs, and the deceased is further advised to bring the part he doesn't eat onto the Sunshade podium itself, where he will meet with Ptah, one of the other deities associated with rebirth and regeneration of the sun. So this establishes that sunshades were associated with mortuary cults of non-royal people as early as the reign of Hatshepsut. In other words, their very first appearance. They're already directly linked to the non-royal dead. This establishes a very interesting precedent. So yes, the dead, these people can go there, but again, they go as a ghost, as a spirit. So in addition to this inscription, as I said, sunshades were often placed within mortuary environments. They're usually small chapels within mortuary temples of pharaohs. We can see this again, Amenhotep III, Ramses III, etc. So Sunshade of Re temples are associated both before and after the Amarna period with mortuary cults, and they're placed in funerary temples and are described as areas where the dead can go to both give and receive offerings. The question that this should raise is why Sunshades of Re temples should be associated with the dead. The most likely answer for this is the regeneration implied by the daily rebirth of the sun god. As we discussed, the resurrection of the sun god every day was a key component of the Sunshade of Re chapels, and the fact that the dead would wish to be associated with the daily rebirth cycle of the sun certainly shouldn't be surprising. Further, the sexual aspects of this rebirth we've discussed in association with Nefertiti and all the royal women would have also played a role in making this location ideal for the daily rebirth not only of the sun, but the dead at Amarna as well. This provides us with some interesting information regarding the mortuary cults of the non-royal elite at Tel el-Amarna. As I said, the rituals of burial and the means of sustenance in the afterlife are almost completely unknown from this time period because they're not described in any detail in any of the tombs. So the discovery of the Rowed-an-Aten and its association with the Sunshade of Re at Kom allows us a very first dim, tiny glimpse into some of the activities that would have taken place to sustain the dead for eternity under Atenism. Many of the other tombs at Tel el-Amarna, if you read the inscriptions carefully, in several instances the dead are further advised that after death they need to go to one of the Aten temples, not necessarily this one, but maybe the Great Aten Temple or the Small Aten Temple. They're supposed to go there as a ghost so that they will be able to hear Akhenaten singing to the Aten for eternity. So this is not entirely surprising. It seems like the temples of Amarna are also all providing mortuary environments for the dead. Again, this is giving us a really interesting peek into what might actually be happening here. Oh, you've sat through the whole thing, you did it. We discussed a lot today, including the role of queens in the Amarna period. We've just reviewed the evidence that suggests the site of Kom as the Sunshade of Re temple of Nefertiti, and we've read texts that demonstrate that the Sunshade of Re temple, whether owned by Nefertiti or not, was also a site associated with the dead in the city of Akhenaten, a site called the Rowed-an-Aten. Since several tombs at Amarna have inscriptions that imply the deceased is obligated to go to the Aten temples after death to hear Akhenaten singing to the Aten, with this new information it may be that Akhenaten replaced at least some of the traditional mortuary cults of his citizens with offerings perhaps from institutions such as the Rowed-an-Aten, overseen by himself and benefiting from the renewal and regeneration brought about by Nefertiti and the rebirth of the sun. And here's some of my bibliography if you want to look it up. Thank you all so much for sitting through it on this cold day. I appreciate it.